Listening to podcasts are a great way to learn about a topic on the go. You're already listening, and I know I don't need to be telling you that, but instead of having your listening time be a passive activity, let's put your learning into action. In fact, you can also use what you are learning here and get credit for it, which I'll explain in this episode. I'll be sharing with you 3 ways on how you can use this podcast, The Elementary STEM Coach, as free PD or professional development for your learning. Welcome to the Elementary STEM Coach Podcast, a show that'll help you with lesson ideas, systems, and actionable tips to apply to your classroom. I am your host, Naomi Meredith, a former classroom teacher turned current STEM teacher and coach. With over a decade of experience teaching and a master's degree in STEM leadership, I am here to coach you throughout the year to help you gain back more time to create innovative experiences for your students. Grab your earbuds and let's get started. I've always listened to audiobooks during my college days, especially when I was student teaching. With my teacher program, I actually didn't get a choice as to which school I got to student teach at, which is fine. That can actually be really intimidating, actually picking a school. So that I was okay with that. But my college had partnerships with local schools in the area and then placed us, which in turn, that helped me get my first teaching job, which that was pretty cool. I was living at home at the time, and my student teaching school was actually 45 minutes away. So I would be driving 45 minutes there in the morning, really early in the morning, and then 45 minutes, sometimes an hour back home. I listened to a lot of fiction audiobooks at the time. I was listening to a book series that I really loved. Also, hate it in book series when you're listening and then they have different readers for another book in the series, and it totally messes up how you interpret the characters. You get really confused. So that was a fun journey. But at the time, a lot of those were actually on CD. Later on, the first podcast I actually got into, which is probably like most of you, was the whole series Serial. And it's not like cereal that you eat. It was like serial killer. Not bad. I shouldn't be laughing at that, but sorry. I'm not too surprised I got into that. It's really, really well produced. It's a great podcast. From there, I got more into true crime, and then I was obsessed with that for a while. I really got into Crime Junkie when I had my townhome. It was a fixer-upper, so I had a lot of time to listen. And then during that time, I don't know how it happened, I started getting into more business podcasts and learning while I was doing. So I've had a lot of inspiration for podcasts, and I've always dreamed of having my own. And in fact, this podcast, The Elementary STEM Coach, is actually my second podcast. Some of you here listening, I know, followed my first show that I co-hosted. I believe it started in 2020 with Spencer Sharp, the Innovative Teacher Podcast. And I believe you can actually go back and listen to that one. So you can hear early podcasting days, and it is different when you're co-hosting. So I've always really enjoyed this whole platform of podcasting and learning through audio and taking advantage of those moments of time where you don't have to be necessarily so focused. You can free up your brain. Well, you should be focused when you're driving, but you know what I'm saying. You have that time where you can be learning on the go. So how can we maximize this time that you're listening to me each week? I appreciate every single one of you that you are choosing me to listen to, which is so kind. And how can we maximize that time listening to this podcast and actually making meaning of that? So I have 3 creative ideas how you can use this podcast as free, meaningful professional development. So we're taking that time that you're listening and putting it into other ways that you can use all the information. The first way that you can use this podcast as free PD is to take notes as you listen. And this sounds like a simple idea, but I know, again, a lot of you listen on the go and you're like, oh, I'll do that later. Oh, I'll do that later. And then you forget what you learn. And also, you don't have to do everything that I say. You can, but you don't have to. So a big way that you can make meaning after you listen, or when you're done with an episode, or let's say you listen halfway before you get out of your car or once you get home from walking the dog, is think about at least one major takeaway as you listen. If you're on the go, you can actually create a folder on your phone in your notes app, or if you use a similar platform like Google Keep or Asana, anything like that, type down one or two major takeaways as you listen. And when you are ready to work on things for your classroom, you can pull out this digital record of those things that you listen to. And then that way you have some inspiration and then you don't feel like you're scrambling. You have all those ideas. So I like to do this. You can even create like a little folder for each podcast that you listen to if you want to keep everything sorted and organized. But that way you are reflecting on the things that you're learning, like what we do with our students, really. We have them write down a major takeaway or the biggest thing that they learn. And so for you as a podcast listener, this will help you keep track of all of the things that you're learning. Another way that you can use this podcast as free PD is not only keep the podcast learning to yourself, but you can share with your teacher besties. And there's a couple ways that you can do this. Like a book club, so think about like a format of a book club. You can decide together with your group which episodes you're going to either listen at the same time. So you could do this in the same room. So maybe you have a time that you are meeting up together. Maybe it's in person, or it even could be virtual. You could have somebody play an episode. One person's in charge of playing it off of their computer, and then you could all listen at the same time. Or let's say, okay, this week we are listening to the two newest episodes from this podcast, the Elementary STEM Coach, and then we're going to come back and talk about it together. So it is really taking ideas from the first way I said, you could share key ideas and then discuss about the topic. This is great for the summertime, especially. So let's say you guys listen to the episodes and then you come together, maybe you're texting about the episode. But also if you are needing an idea for a committee to run, this would be a fun twist on a shared book reading. I actually talked to a teacher recently at a conference that I attended here in Colorado, where I'm from, in EDCO, INNEDCO. And they actually said this is how they're using my podcast at her school, which I felt so honored that there's teachers who are meeting up and then they're talking about the things that they are learning about. This is a fun way to not always have to be forced to reading a book, especially if you are the only STEM teacher at your school or you feel like you're only doing innovative things, that you can choose your own adventure. So learning, of course, isn't just through reading. We know that. And we tell our students that, but then a lot of times our professional development for teachers isn't that. So it's just a cool twist that you can use this podcast in a creative way. And if you're doing this, if you are using this as PD as a group, take a picture and tag me on Instagram. I really want to see at Naomi Meredith _. Show me what you're doing. Now, also on the side, if you do need a book club idea, there's something. I am not bashing reading. I love to read. I love to learn. I'm always learning in lots of different ways. But if you do need a book club idea, you can actually check out my STEM Teacher Bookshelf membership. And there's a new book every month, which is definitely doable, especially with the books that I'm choosing. And every book gets its own guide. So whenever you join, you get access to all of the past guides and all of the content. So if there's something that in my book club, you saw a book, you're like, oh my gosh, that looks really great. It was in May. You could still get all of that stuff as well. So that's another idea. You could do both. You could do the podcast and then you could do the book and mix it in as your professional development. And the last way that you can use this podcast as free PD is you can pick specific topics that you want to learn. Now, I know when you first go into this podcast, the Elementary STEM Coach, you look at it on your phone, you're like, oh my gosh, that's a lot of episodes. I'm overwhelmed. But you can actually just pick and choose the episodes that you want to learn about. You don't have to listen to them in order. You definitely can. You can even go back to episode 1, especially if you're listening here in the summer. If you're new here, I encourage you to actually go back to the beginning because a lot of that content is actually relative for back to school time because this podcast came out, if you're listening to this live, almost a year ago, July 18th, I believe it was, 2022. So if you go back to the beginning, you're going to find stuff for back to school anyway. Also, I often record little series throughout. So there's multiple episodes in a row that apply to the same topic. So sometimes when I'm talking about something, there's a lot of different ways that that conversation can go. So that's why there might be a lot of episodes in a row that will go together. So you could definitely listen to those mini series. Now, I know this podcast like the back of my hand. I often know what episode number are pretty close to if someone's asking, hey, do you have an episode about blah, blah, blah? I almost always can refer to it or I can find it really, really fast. And so with that in mind, I created a free podcast playlist where I already organized all the episodes for you. This podcast is free. The playlists are free. So this will be linked in the show notes. It's at naomimeredith.com/podcast playlist. All one word, no spaces. So what it is it's a spreadsheet where I have on the first tab of the spreadsheet all of the links to the playlist. So it's really cool. And I was working with my podcast manager on this, the best way to do this. So thanks, Andrea. It works like the podcast here. So you're going to see all of the categories. So coding and robotics, makerspace and STEM supplies, community engagement, different main categories that the episodes fall under. Now, a lot of them fall under multiple things, but I try to pick the category that best fits. So you will see all of the different playlists, and then you could access all of the playlists. There's no time limit on these as of now. So access the playlist that interests you. You'll click on the link and then it will prompt you to add the playlist to your podcast player and it will pop up in your podcast player just like how this one does. So then any new episodes that I add to the playlist, they're not exclusive episodes, by the way. So it's all pre-existing episodes. They're just organized into categories. So whenever I am organizing other episodes that are new on this main podcast, it will go into the playlist. So then you don't have to read down those playlists, if that makes sense. So you'll have links to all that. You can add all of them. You can add some of them. So if there's a specific topic that you are wondering about, you can grab that playlist. And then the other tabs on the spreadsheet has all of the titles of those episodes in the playlist listed in order of when they were released. So you can see what episode number it is from the main podcast and then the title. And then it also has the length of the episode rounded to the nearest minute. There's also a checkbox you can click if you have listened to that episode. And then you just type in on the side how many minutes you listened to that episode. It could probably be the full thing. And then you'll see that all of those minutes will actually start totaling up the amount of time you spent listening. So you're like, well, why does this even matter? I have teachers all the time talk to me about how can I get credit for the work that I'm doing? I have to turn in these hours in this professional development that I'm doing, not for college credit, but just recertification hours. You can keep track of all this time you're listening on the podcast as recertification hours. So when you're adding up all those minutes, you'll have the minutes for each podcast, for each playlist, You'll have the minutes from each playlist. And then you can total those up in a way that works best, convert them to hours if you need to. And then inside of this whole freebie, there's also a certificate where you can type in the total amount of time you spent listening to this podcast, the Elementary STEM Coach, and then turn that in for your free professional development hours. So this is something that you were going to do anyway, but I know for you, sorting my own podcast in categories is going to take you much longer than I can because I'm like, oh yeah, it's blah, 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 blah. So I already did that for you. It will be updated every so often with the new episodes when they're come out. So I will say when you make a copy of it, it obviously doesn't update with the new episodes, but you can always type it into, if you see it pop up in your podcast player, you could just type in those minutes as well. So this is just a fun, creative way to earn those hours. And like I said, podcast listening is one of them. Reading is one of them. Actually, in my STEM Teacher Bookshelf membership, I give them a spreadsheet as well to keep track of the time that they are reading and participating in the STEM Teacher Bookshelf membership. So if you're looking for a couple of ways and easy ways, things you're going to do anyway, use this podcast and track all of that time this summer or whenever. And then you can also join in on the STEM Teacher Bookshelf membership and track all of that time too. So both will be linked in the show notes where you can grab both of those. But definitely just a fun way to keep track of the time and the time that you're hanging out with me, make meaning of it. As a recap, here are the 3 ways that you can use this podcast, The Elementary STEM Coach, as free professional development. First, take notes as you listen. Next, share with your teacher besties. And third, pick specific topics and you can record that with the podcast playlist. Again, grab those free podcast playlists and the spreadsheet. I will keep it free for you to save you time, but grab that free podcast and playlist and spreadsheet to track your minutes by going to naomimeredith.com/podcast playlist. Again, thank you so much for listening. I can't believe we have made it to episode 98. It has definitely flown by. I never thought I would keep doing 2 episodes a week, but you guys are listening. I see the numbers and I've been talking to people who listen. It's so incredible. I love the emails that you guys send me. And I've even met some people at the conference that I just went to who listen. And it's just, I love being able to put a face to a number, really, of who is out there listening. So I appreciate all of you spending time with me each week and letting me be your guide and your elementary STEM coach. So thank you so much again. Grab that free spreadsheet and all the playlists, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the Elementary STEM Coach podcast. I would love to connect with you over on Instagram at @NaomiMeredith_ or send me an email to elementarystemcoachpodcast@gmail.com. Also, make sure to check out my website, naomimeredith.com, to see all the show notes from today's episode and shop my K-5 STEM resources. Any questions you have, needs for resources, or ideas for episodes, get in touch. I'll talk to you soon.